Welcome to part 2 of the central nervous system. In this lecture, we were talking about the Diencephalon and the Mesencephalon. So let's go. First of all, the Diencephalon is made out of the thalamus, which is egg-shaped mass of consistent gray matter, which is arranged in certain nuclei and divided by two bands of white matter. We have first of all the internal medullary lamina, which is Y-shaped, is composed of three parts. The posterior part separates into the medial and lateral nuclei, with the middle and inferior bifurcation situated around the central median nucleus, and the anterior part, anterior bifurcation, situated around the anterior nuclei. Then there's the external medullary lamina. There's not much to say aside from it separating the reticular nucleus and lateral semmis from the thalamus. Each thalamus is situated on each side of superior part of third ventricle and medial to posterior limb of the internal capsule. It has an internal, postural, and the posterior caudal pulse, with four surfaces. The superior surface, which is directed towards the central part of the lateral ventricle and forms its floor, with six visible structures, it being the choroid plexus, the stria terminalis, the amygdaloid body, and the hypothalamus. The terminus stria is most laterally between the caudate nucleus and the thalamus. The thalamus striate vein is a very important tributary of the internal cerebral vein and goes inside the stria terminalis. Then there is the lamina fixa. It is white matter between terminus stria and choroid plexus, with its anterior tubercle and its pulvinar. Then there is the inferior surface joined to the hypothalamus, the medial surface between medulla stria of thalamus and hypothalamic sulcus, which gives the lateral wall of the third ventricle. Then there is also the nuclear mass, or massa intermedia, connecting the two thalami as interthalamic adhesion across the lumen of the third ventricle. Lateral surface is joined with the posterior limb of the internal capsule and covered by extended medullary lamina. Here the thalamic nuclei are arranged. There are certain anatomical and functional classifications, and the principle is basically related to its location. The internal medullary lamina separates these nuclei into medial, lateral, and dorsal groups. The ventral anterior nucleus influences activity of the motor cortex, with efferent fibers made out of premotor cortex, substantia nigra, corpus striatum, reticular formation, hypothalamus, other thalamic nuclei. There is no difference with the efferent fibers. With the ventral lateral nuclei, it influences motor activity of motor cortex. Afferent fibers are premotor cortex, substantia nigra, corpus striatum, reticular formation, hypothalamus, other thalamic nuclei, cerebellum nucleus. It is the same as with the ventral anterior nucleus, with the addition of the red nucleus in the cerebellum. The afferent fibers is just the same. The ventral posterior lateral nucleus relays common sensations to consciousness, with its afferent fibers, medial and spinal lemnisci, and afferent fibers from primary somatic sensory cortex. Then there is the ventral posterior medialis nucleus, relays common sensation to consciousness. Afferent fibers are trigeminal lemniscus and gustatory fibers. Afferent fibers primary somatic sensory cortex. Then the general functions of the thalamus. It relays and processes sensory motor information going to the cerebral cortex, where almost all of the sensory information converges on the thalamus, except that of smell. It allows for different areas of cortex to communicate with one another especially with information to the association areas of cortex, and sets an idle for cerebral cortex, ensuring that all areas of cortex receive continuous input. Then we have the metathalamus. It is formed by the posterior part of Diencephalon, situated below the pulvinar, and has genicular bodies. The latter genicular body is the part of thalamoencephalon related to sensory nucleus of visual pathway, also known as the retinogeniculo-calcarine pathway. Then there is the medial geniculate body, which is part of thalamoencephalon related to sensory nucleus of hearing. Then we gotta go to the epithalamus, one of the most dorsal part of thalamoencephalon, and consists of many parts. The habenula is composed of white matter. This happens to the best of us, trust me. Habenula is composed of white matter, nerve fibers, starting at the habenular trigone and going to the pineal body. Function of habenula is uncertain, however, it is presumed to mediate the olfactory stimuli and feeding behavior. This is the habenular trigone, occupied by middle and the lateral habenular nuclei, connected with the stria medullaris of thalamus. White matter starting from peripheral part of diencephalon. Then the habenular commissure connects habenular nuclei of both sides. Epithalamic and posterior commissure. Pineal body above the superior colliculi of the mesencephalon manufactures the melatonin, controlling the circadian rhythm. A malfunction at the pineal body may lead to premature, incomplete, or delayed puberty. Enlargement tumor of pineal body may close the aqueduct of the midbrain and lead to the internal hydrocephalus. Then the hypothalamus is most ventral part of the encephalon and located beneath the hypothalamic sulcus. Comprises floor of third ventricle. It has a preoptic area at the junction of the hypothalamus and the telencephalon. An optic tract, infundibular stalk, joining pituitary gland with tubus cinereum. Hypophysis, we also call it pituitary gland. Tubus cinereum, gray matter at or in between the optic chyme and the mammillary bodies. Then there's the mammillary bodies, which are oval-shaped structures with the nuclei. Hypothalamic nuclei. The anterior group includes the paraventricular nucleus, forming a plate of neurons along the wall of the third ventricle. It releases antidiuretic hormone, vasopressin, also oxytocin. Then there's the supraoptic nucleus, which covers the optic tract and releases ADH and oxytocin. Preoptic nucleus lies anteriorly to the supraoptic nucleus, controlling heat loss, parasympathetic excitation. Suprachiasmatic nucleus covers also the optic chiasm and receives retina afferens. Within the middle group we have the lateral hypothalamic nucleus, extending towards the posterior part of hypothalamus. The ventral medial nucleus, a large nucleus at the mid-hypothalamic level. The dorsal medial nucleus at the mid-hypothalamic level. Both of these medial nuclei control appetite, fat metabolism, and aggression. In its posterior group we find posterior hypothalamic nucleus, which lies in the posterior part of hypothalamus, controlling heat preservation, sympathetic excitation, mediate sleep-wake cycle, and consciousness. Middle mammillary nucleus and lateral mammillary nucleus, which are both involved in short, long memory and circuitous purpose. The pituitary gland lies beneath the diagram of the sella in the hypophysis fossa and the sella turcica. It is divided into dual origin adenohypophysis, vagination from oral ectoderm, and denora hypophysis, invagination from the hypothalamus. This pituitary gland communicates with help of the pituitary stalk. infundibulum, where we find two neural tracts. First, we have the tubero-infundibular tract, which conveys axons and releases hormones from the ventromedial, infundibular, and tubular nuclei of the hypothalamus to the portal blood system of the stalk. The released hormones get to the adenohypophysis, controls secretion of trophic hormones. These hormones control function of organs and tissues like the thyroid gland, suprarenal gland, ovary, testis, mammary gland, bone, and fat tissue. It releases thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, luteinizing hormone, follicle stimulating hormone, growth hormone, prolactin. Happens too often, unfortunately. I don't want to trim this video, so who cares? Then there's the supraoptical hypophyseal tract, which conveys the axons from the supraoptic paraventricular nuclei to the neurohypophysis. Certain hormones are released like ADH vasopressin, controlling water absorption in the kidney, and oxytocin, causes contraction of the uterus during delivery. Generally, hypothalamus is essential because it controls endocrine system, fluid balance, body temperature, feeding behavior, and sexual activity. Here the subthalamus is situated between thalamus and hypothalamus, near the internal capsule, connected with the cerebral peduncle margins, and consisting of the subthalamic nucleus, controlling autonomic activity, nuclei of perizomal fields, medial field H, dorsal field H1, ventral field H2. Zone incerta, we call it uncertain zone, plate of gray matter between thalamus, hypothalamus, and subthalamic nucleus, belonging to the extrapyramidal motor system. It has the prerubral area and ansa reticularis, which goes under the internal capsule from the outer portion of globus pallidus and enters forest field H. Then there's this field H splitting into the two laminae, field H1, the thalamic vesiculus, dividing into pallidothalamic, dentatothalamic, and medial limniscus tract. Then there are H2, the lenticular fasciculus, goes from the inner portion and perforates into the internal capsule for its field H2. Certain clinical comments are important. Disturbances may cause the hypothalamus disturbance of the temperature balance, hypothermia and hyperthermia. Then there's the loss of appetite and excessive appetite, anorexia and hyperphagia. Then the malfunctioning of the kidney, abnormal volume of urine, oliguria, polyuria, precocious puberty, delayed puberty, disturbance of the growth, gigantism, dwarfism, lethargy, aggression, uncontrolled twisting movements of the body, hemiballismus. There's a nice graph for you. Pause the video, study it hard so you remember it, guys. And there's the third ventricle, empty space filled with cerebrospinal fluid, and situated within the diencephalon, located between the thalamia. Third ventricle has the 6 walls. Superior wall is composed of tela choroidea, fornix, corpus callosum. Inferior wall composed of hypothalamus. Lateral wall composed of the medial wall of thalamus. Then there's the anterior, composed of anterior commissure, lamina terminalis, and columns of fornix. Posterior, composed of habenular commissure and thalamic commissure. Then the 5 recesses. Suprapineal recess is above the habenular commissure. Pineal recess above posterior commissure and below habenular commissure. Triangular recess between the anterior commissure and columns of the fornix. Optic recess between borders of the floor and anterior boundary. Mandibular recess is above the infundibulum. Then let's quickly talk about the mesencephalon. Its functions are controlling motor and sensory functions, including eye, head, neck movements, and the coordination of visual and auditory reflexes. It consists of the tectum on its dorsal side, suberopeduncles on its ventral side, suberocrira basis, tegmentum, the mesencephalic aqueduct, which separates the tectum and the suberopeduncles, and it's a narrow canal extending between the third and fourth ventricle. The tectum has following parts: tectal plate with the superior collicus and inferior collicus. Both colliculi are located below the splenium of the corpus callosum, is separated by a transverse cerebral fissure. Composed of this nuclei inferior colliculi nucleus, receiving auditory fibers, sends them to the medial geniculate body. Superior collicular nuclei receive fibers from the optic tracts, visual cortex, medial lemniscus, and send these to the spinal cord, reticular formation, and motor or cranial nerve nuclei. These fibers form the tectospinal tract, tectonuclear tract, and tectoreticular tract. Brachium of the superior inferior colliculi. There's the superior collicus brachium, which connects superior collicula via the lateral geniculate body. The inferior colliculus joins the brachium with the medial geniculate body. Then there's the cerebral peduncles, produced from the hemispheres attached to the pons. The angle between them is about 80 degrees. It is called the interpeduncular fossa in between. The bottom of this fossa we call the posterior perforated substance. CN3 emerges from this fossa. Cerebral peduncles are divided by the substantia nigra into the basis or crus cerebri, which goes downwards, including pyramidal tract, corticopontine tract, and corticoreticular fibers. The tegmentum, which translates to the covering of the basis, is a plate of neurons and tracts within the tectum or in between the tectum and the basis. It is composed of white matter and gray matter. The gray matter consists of substantia nigra. There's compact and reticular, and connects through afferent fibers with corpus striatum, cortex, subthalamic nucleus, rougher nuclei, superior colliculus, and its afferent fibers pass to striatum. The reticular formation, I will be talking next lesson about it. Importantly, but there's the red nucleus, which consists of magnocellular and parvocellular parts. The afferent fibers pass to this nucleus via the superior cerebral peduncles from the cerebellum. They also pass to red nucleus from the cortex, substantia nigra, reticular formation, superior colliculus. Its afferent fibers originate from the rubrospinal tract to spinal cord, rubro-olivary tract, and rubro-reticular tract. Its main afferents are deep cerebral nuclei and cortical motor areas. Its main afferents are cross projections to the deep cerebral nuclei, principal sensory trigeminal nucleus, and facial. The cerebrospinal tract includes central gyrus substance, which is located around the cerebral aqueduct. There are present dorsal rougher nucleus, nucleus of posterior commissure, and a tract called dorsal longitudinal fasciculus, which passes from hypothalamus to the mesencephalon. There's also the interpeduncular nucleus. We can also find sensory mesencephalic nucleus of trigeminal nerve, motor nucleus of the trochlear nerve, motor and parasympathetic nuclei of the oculomotor nerve. Its white matter consists of long sensory tracts extending from the spinal cord, cerebellum, and pons, with the medial lemniscus originating from nuclei gracilis and cuneatus, and its specific thalamic sensory nucleus. Its superior cerebral peduncles originate in cerebellum and in red nucleus, cross midbrain form the accusation of superior cerebral peduncles. Its lateral lemniscus, the part of the cochlear pathway, originates from trapezoid body and extends to inferior colliculus and medial geniculate body. The medial longitudinal fasciculus anastomosis with the motor nuclei of cranial nerves for the muscle of the eyes, CN3, CN4, CN6, the stimuli from vestibular part of internal ear, coordinates movements of head, neck, and eyeball. Dorsal longitudinal fasciculus anastomosis with the hypothalamus, parasympathetic nuclei of cranial nerves. 3, 7, 9, and 10. Motor nuclei of cranial nerves 7, 12. And we assume its function of the dorsal vesicles is connected with the salivary secretion and tongue movements. Now we get a small drive into the arteries and vessels of the brain, starting with one of the most important, the vertebral artery, with alongside the internal carotid artery joins the famous circle of Willis. The vertebral artery has its origin in arising from subclavian artery, and its course is that both vertebral arteries join together on the caudal border of the pons, form basilar artery, passes superiorly through the transverse foramen on each of the cervical vertebrae above C7, pieces above C1 atlanto-occipital membrane, runs into the posterior cranial fossa via the foramen magnum. It is located on each side of the anterior cervix of the medulla. It has several branches: the posterior inferior cerebellar artery, posterior spinal artery, and anterior spiral artery. The basilar artery, one of its branches, has its origin on the caudal border of the pons to the point where two vertebral arteries join together. It terminates at the anterior border of the pons and at that point bifurcates into two posterior cerebral arteries. It passes on the anterior surface of the pons in the midline. Its branches are anterior inferior cerebral, superior cerebral, labyrinthine, and pontine arteries. Its posterior cerebral arteries are formed by the bifurcation of the basilar artery, turns lateral and posterior and passes above the crus cerebra. It's backwards along the lateral aspect of the midbrain. Posterior cerebral artery supplies inferior and medial surface temporal and occipital lobes. Sorry, third time's the charm, right? With two branches, posterior temporal artery and internal occipital artery. And we have the circle of Willis, which is formed mainly by the anterior communicating artery, middle cerebral artery, posterior communicating artery, and posterior cerebral artery. Then we have here the internal carotid artery, with its origin being arising from the bifurcation of the common carotid artery, level upper border of the thyroid cartilage. At the end, it terminates intracranially within the middle cranial fossa, medial to the anterior cleanup process of the sphenoid bone. The vessel ascends to the base of the skull, first being located posteriorly to the external carotid artery, then medial to that artery. It leaves the neck by passing through carotid canal of the petrous part of temporal bone, and passes upwards and forwards by the cavernous sinus, pierces the roof of the sinus, turns backwards on itself before dividing into anterior and middle cerebral arteries. It has following branches: carotid tympanic branches within the carotid canal, pterygoid arteries, ninja branch, posterior communicating artery, which anastomoses with middle and posterior cerebral arteries. Anterior cerebral artery arises at the bifurcation of the carotid artery, dorsally to the optic nerve, and communicates with another via anterior communicating artery. Then passes along longitudinal fissure and supplies medial aspect of the hemispheres till parieto-occipital fissure. The middle cerebral artery is continuation of the internal carotid artery running to the lateral cerebral fossa, terminating at the cortical branches, which supply a large amount of the lateral aspect of the hemispheres. Also the ophthalmic artery. There are two groups of veins we have to take for granted, the superficial one and the deep one. They are all devoid of valves, as are the dural sinuses. The superficial group take origin in the surface of the cortex and subcortical white matter, consisting of the superior cerebral veins joining the middle surface of the hemispheres and joining superior sagittal sinus. The inferior cerebral veins collect blood from inferior surface of the hemispheres and join basal sinus. Superficial cerebral vein receives blood from many veins from the surface of the hemispheres joining cavernous sinus. The group of veins consists of the internal cerebral vein, receiving blood from veins around the roof of the third ventricle, choroid vein, thalamostroid vein, septal vein, imithalamic vein, lateral ventricular vein, basal vein, lying under the medial part of the anterior lobe, receiving anterior cerebral vein, deep middle cerebral vein, fused striate vein. And the great cerebral vein empties into the rectus sinus, receiving blood from internal cerebral veins, basal veins, occipital veins, and posterior callosal veins. I guess that was all, folks. Hope you studied and keep rocking.